Welcome. Hi, I'm Mikki, and this is Mikkipedia, where I sit down and chat to doctors, professors, athletes, practitioners, and experts in their fields related to health, nutrition, fitness, and well-being. And I'm delighted that you're here. Hey everyone, welcome to Mikkipedia. I am Mikki Williden, and you are listening to me have a conversation with my friend Cliff Harvey again on the show. This week, Dr. Cliff Harvey brings his knowledge and expertise in the area of fasting, and so we have a really good conversation about our own clinical experience and how we interpret the scientific information in and around fasting. And I know that those of you who are interested in time-restricted feeding, who have dabbled in a bit of intermittent fasting, 16-8, 1 meal a day, OMAD, that kind of thing, hopefully you will enjoy these insights. And if it's new to you and it's not really something you've ever really thought about, then maybe this will just be like a good platform to sort of begin those conversations. This was recorded right at the start of our lockdown here in Auckland, and I mentioned that I will be speaking to Don Layman, and in fact I already did speak to Professor Layman, and that was a few episodes ago. So it was a little bit out of order, but hey, this information is timeless anyway. So to remind you, Cliff Harvey is New Zealand's expert on the effects of a ketogenic diet in a healthy population, but he is so much more than that. He has been helping people to live healthier, happier lives and to perform better since starting in clinical practice way back in the late 1990s. Over this time, he has been privileged to work with many Olympic, professional, Commonwealth and other high-performing athletes. He has also worked with many people to overcome the effects of chronic and debilitating health conditions. And along the way, he has founded or co-founded many successful businesses in the health, fitness and wellness space, including the Nutrition Store Online, where my name Mikki, M-I-K-K-I, in capitals, saves you 10% off any purchases, and the Holistic Performance Institute, which is New Zealand's leading certification and diploma for health, nutrition, health coaching and performance, that has many of the world experts teaching on that course. So students really are learning from the best. He has over 20 years as a strength and nutrition coach experience, and in addition to his PhD research, he is a registered clinical nutritionist, qualified naturopath, and holds a diploma in fitness training and health coaching in patient care. So you can find Cliff over at cliffharvey.com, and also the Nutrition Store Online at www.nutritionstore.online. And we will put all of those links to Cliff and how you can find him and his Holistic Performance Institute and Nutrition Store Online in the show notes. Before you dive into this interview, I'd just like to remind you that the best way to support the podcast is to subscribe on your favourite platform and leave a 5-star review. That would be amazing because it just increases our visibility and our reach to more people. And if you are wanting to support just a little bit more, you can sign up to the Recipe Access portal on my website, mikkiwilliden.com, which gives you access to over 600 recipes that are regularly updated, to my weekly email, to member-only Facebook group pages and forums and Facebook Lives, and the ability to pick my brain on anything nutrition related through our platform online messaging system. All right, team. For now, though, please enjoy this conversation that I have with Dr. Cliff Harvey. Yeah. So, Clifford, it's been a minute. Not actually that long. It's like been a week since we've caught up, which, you know, I feel very privileged that I get to have another hour of your time. So thank you for joining me today.
Oh, the pleasure's all mine, of course, Mikki. Dr. Williden, I should say.
Dr. Williams, come on. Dr. Williden's right. And obviously last time we caught up, we spoke on sort of issues much wider than nutrition, much wider than sort of the individual and their behaviours and how it impacts health. You know, we geek out on a lot of things, but last week was not, that wasn't our conversation. This week, however, I'm just quite interested to have a bit of a geek out on that individual behavior stuff, on things around fasting, on your, any sort of evolution in your thinking around it, ketogenic diets. I don't know, just, that whole sort of scope of what we seem to have Twitter arguments about every week.
Yeah.
Well, okay, wait. I don't have a Twitter argument, but I see and note Twitter arguments. So yeah. Are you fasting this morning? Let me start there.
No, I'm not. Straight up, I'm not. I don't. I tend to not fast nowadays because I like to have a shake straight after training. So I train every morning and have a big protein shake. So somewhere between 40 to 60 grams of protein, pretty low carbs really, maybe a little bit of fat added in, but I keep it pretty much just protein heavy in the morning. But I find if I don't have that shake after training, I tend to undershoot my protein intake pretty consistently. Even if I've got attention on trying to get it in from whole food, it's just, life gets in the way and it doesn't get up to that optimal level. So I just feel a heck of a lot better when I'm having that big protein shake in the morning.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? I was listening to a podcast with Professor Don Lehman, who in fact is coming on Mikkipedia. I'm interviewing him next week, which I'm super excited about. And he is like one of these, I'm not going to say he's a pioneer in the protein space, but he might, certainly in this sort of the last 30, 40 years, he's really informed how we understand protein metabolism, protein breakdown, and things like that.
I think it'd be fair to say he's a pioneer because previous to, probably the last 20 years, I think protein was really underappreciated as a nutrient, except for maybe at various times through history, people had sort of had an interest in it and maybe promoted the benefits of higher protein. I think the fairly structural thought pattern was that, protein intake didn't need to be all that high. And so I think people like Lehman and a lot of the people that were early on involved in setting up the ISSN, who are really promoting higher levels of protein intake for athletes, but then obviously that sort of translates out into the mainstream population as well. I mean, they definitely were pioneers, and a lot of those guys were really the reason why I started looking outside of the normal nutrition paradigm into, higher protein, lower carb, all that kind of stuff.
Do you know, I feel like my sort of introduction into the importance of protein was on the back of Bill Phillips. Now, do you remember the name Bill Phillips?
Well, I remember it very well because I was involved with the AES back in the 90s. And so I didn't know Bill personally, but I had had some brief conversations with people at EAS, including his brother Sean. I had conversations back in the day with people who were involved with muscle media, like Charles Poliquin and TC Luoma, all those types of people. I was in, communication with Pavel back in the day. And so I was pretty in, not in with those guys, but I certainly knew them by extension, and they maybe knew of me. They probably wouldn't remember now. But I also had a couple of supplement shops, and we sold EAS supplements, and we were, I think, one of the first stores, if not the first store, to really get on board with their Body for Life program. And we helped a number of people go through that who went on to be regional champions and all sorts.
I've got to say, like that. So yes, for those people who are unfamiliar, EAS was a massive, and it continues to be a massive sort of supplement brand. But I believe maybe they've been bought out by someone else. But I still see Myplex stuff and whatnot around. But back in, it was a late 90s for me, early 2000s. I got my hands on that Body for Life book, and whilst yes, it was written by Bill Phillips, and it was set up as a plan for to balance both your training and your nutrition. It was pretty simple principles, if I'm recalling correctly, and it was certainly a balanced approach to diet where you had a fist of protein, a fist of carbs, 2 fists of vegetables, a thumb of fat, and you had that 6 times a day. Or that might be wrong, but not too far removed from possibly what they suggested. In addition to that, the training wasn't hardcore. They were sort of really streamlining the training approach in the book, and so it might have been 20 minutes of cardio or 20 minutes of weights most days of the week. You got they called it a cheat day. You and I aren't necessarily in with that line of description of, just eating whatever you like. But there was a Sunday was the cheat day, and then the closer you got to your end of your 12 weeks, as I understand it, the more that cardio ramped up, and people really tried to kind of push the gamut on their exercise to get as lean and fit as possible within that 12 weeks. And whilst yes, of course, it was built and designed around EAS supplements, I particularly remember the book and Bill writing in the book, hey, you don't actually need the supplements. You can do it all sort of from food. And I think seeing the balance of nutrients in those meals back at that time when I was studying my undergraduate in physical education, just about to begin my nutrition degree, I remember thinking, oh yeah, protein. I never really thought about protein before.
Yeah, it was a very simple program. And, looking at it now, 25 odd years later from when I first was involved with it, it would still work. It's not like it's old or outdated. It's not like it was, a fad or that it was extreme. Although obviously some participants did take the challenge very seriously and did become pretty extreme with it. The Body for Life system itself was just based around basic portion planning, which a lot of us, I guess, would use iterations of, not that we're iterating that, but, we would all use portion planning in some respects for our clients. I often recommend, if people don't need further quantification, that they just take that modular approach to meal planning, where they're sort of looking at 1 to 2 palm sizes of protein. I tend to obviously prioritize protein, then veggies, then fat, and then have carb as the sort of flexible nutrient. But irrespective, it's still more or less the same, and the outcomes are pretty good. It's pretty basic stuff.
Yeah, it is. And I think we got on this because, that I'm very similar to you in that our sort of approach to nutrition. And whilst people don't like it, I would say that you and I are probably in the camp of, I'm going to say it, earning your carbs. Like that's essentially your carb intake would needs to sort of match your activity, because it's a fuel source. And so for the most part, if you are looking at optimizing body composition, that's the nutrient, that flexible nutrient. You have a bit more if you're a bit active, a bit less if you're less active. And the way some people term that is, of course, earning your carbohydrate. But I know, I'll have 18 people DM me after they hear me say that and say, oh, you're setting people up for obsessiveness around food, whatever. My point, though, about 10 minutes ago was the whole protein at breakfast. And you mentioned that you don't feel great if you don't have that protein input. And Professor Lehman, which is something I'm super interested to talk to him about, is he's of the similar mindset that what really matters in terms of protein intake is that hit at breakfast and that hit at dinner, actually.
Yeah.
So it's not that lunch protein doesn't matter, but we actually can't say that it does because there hasn't been a lot of research in that middle meal space.
Yeah, that would probably match my biggest protein intake would definitely be first thing in the morning after training. I train fasted. And at night, typically a smaller lunch, and that's a behavioral thing. I know that we'll probably talk a bit about behavioral aspects of nutrition today, but that's critically important. If I have a really big lunch, irrespective of whether it's low carb, high carb, whatever, I do feel more sluggish. So my pattern at the moment, because I'm, trying to put some muscle on and lose a bit of body fat. I know that those aren't always complementary, but just basically trying to, just lean up a little bit, is to really prioritize protein intake. So I have a big protein shake in the morning. I always, because of expedience, I mix up 2 or 3, meals worth of shakes, so I can just put them in jars in the fridge. Nice. So I have a big protein shake first thing in the morning. I usually a smaller lunch because I don't really want to overload. I have, again, a big protein shake, the same one that I've had for breakfast immediately after I finish work, and I finish work quite early, around 3 p.m. And then, a bigger dinner. So dinner's my biggest meal, which I know some people don't agree with, but it just works with me, or for me, because I find it's a really good way, because we eat fairly early, to really just relax. Obviously food irrespective, but also if you're having some carbohydrate with that meal, that does suppress cortisol levels. It really does help to slip into that relaxation cycle, despite the fact that some people are, very committed to different circadian patterns where they say you should eat most of your calories in the morning. I really think that if we look at the research on that, it is quite equivocal. We do see a lot of variability between studies, but also between individuals.
Yeah.
And if we take a step back, we also need to consider that for most of these things that we discuss, the effect between different strategies, or the effect size between different strategies, is pretty small, right?
Yeah.
The difference in the effect. So really what works well for someone, assuming it is working, is, a viable strategy. And I don't think we should really try and, go down the rabbit hole and criticize people's structures if they're working. Because they may not fit with best practice. They may not fit with what we believe is the, purported best, and it may not fit with what we do. But all of that's inconsequential.
Yeah, it's really interesting, that whole fasting, time-restricted eating space. And I know it's a super exciting thing to be able to see the emerging studies and see the potential benefits for a lot of people in that time-restricted eating space. And that, if you're looking at a population, if nothing else, they shorten their eating window to, say, even 10 to 12 hours, they're going to get some sort of purported benefit, depending on where they come from. And it's always context. And I'm really so mindful of that now, because of, I would say, for probably 80% of the time right now, I'm probably outside of that 12-hour eating window because of my training being earlier, and also I have dinner, but I'm a little bit like you, Cliff, in that instead of having that protein shake sort of mid-afternoon, I tend to have it after dinner as a sort of, I used to have like chocolate and peanut butter, but actually I'd feel a bit sluggish and my digestion wouldn't be so great, because, peanut butter's great, but for me, I can't have a lot of it without having sort of digestive issues.
Right.
But having that protein nice cream, I call it, so I sort of make the protein shake, but it's really thick and delicious. And that's after dinner. But then if I'm training early, and if I'm doing either like I'm just coming off a big block of training whereby I'm going to be consuming fuel before I train, because actually overall I do need it. Whereas if I was just sort of being much more relaxed in my training, not really training for anything, I can easily do fasted training if it's a shorter session, or, it's an inconsequential session, if you like. But
yeah,
with my training load, as it has been, my eating window is beyond what the time-restricted eating experts would say is optimal. However, that said, I am athletic. I'm not the person that you will often see in these studies. I'm not sedentary, overweight, carrying excess body fat, or metabolically unhealthy. So I think that's a context that people forget with time-restricted eating and fasting.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this is an area in which there's a lot of mechanisms are discussed. People talk a lot about the mechanisms of, well, not the mechanisms of fasting, but the mechanistic outcomes of fasting, like autophagy, like, increases in NAD, things like that. And that's all very interesting, but we also obviously need to return to the research and look at what the functional outcomes are. And there's quite a lot of research on fasting.
Yeah.
I've reviewed all of the research on fasting periodically through the years, because, I became interested in fasting as a kid, really, for not physiological, but for sort of spiritual reasons. I was a practicing Buddhist, most of my life. But then I became more interested in fasting for its physiological benefits in the late 90s, when I was working with some Islamic bodybuilders. And so they were really concerned about the effects of the Ramadan fast on their progress in bodybuilding. And even looking at the research back then in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s, there wasn't a lot, but there was enough, especially coming out of Middle Eastern universities. And it was really showing that there wasn't really a decrement resulting from fasting. There were actually a lot of benefits. And so, we always need to go back to that. But we also need to consider that when fasting is compared to standard calorie restriction, although, individual results vary between studies, if we look at reviews of that, so we look at the research broadly, I mean, the results are pretty much the same, with the exception of probably one marker, I'd say, where IGF-1 is typically lower in fasting versus calorie restriction. So there might be benefits there for cancer, for example, prevention of cancer or cancer treatment. But outside of that, the vast majority of any benefits are simply due to calorie restriction. And so I think what that leads is to a couple of elephants in the room, right? Number one is that people talk a lot about the benefits of fasting, and therefore people should fast. And that's pretty much where I draw the line. And this isn't a shift in my thinking. This is a consistent thought that I've had for 24 years, I guess.
Yeah.
Is that we can't apply one thing arbitrarily to all people. Because if the major benefit is that it helps people to auto-regulate their energy intake, and for most people that's of benefit because it's auto-regulating them down, if someone is a habitual undereater and there's a potential there that they auto-regulate their energy intake down even further, then they're going to become even more energy deficient. So they're going to be more likely to suffer from those, sort of red S, relative energy deficiency syndrome symptoms. And so I don't think we can apply fasting universally when some people are going to be habitual undereaters. And while most people are probably not in that camp, I do think it's a significant minority of people, maybe up to, who knows, we're just sort of spitballing, but we sort of estimate that it's probably around 20% of people are habitual undereaters. The other elephant in the room, I think, is protein intake. Given that we want to optimize protein, and let's say for me at my body weight, I'm wanting to get in a minimum of 160 grams of protein a day, it is going to be quite difficult to do that if I'm following, say, a 1 meal a day approach or even a 2 meal a day approach, because those are pretty massive meals. And I wouldn't consider that my protein synthesis from those enormous meals is going to be optimal. We certainly don't need to eat 6 or 8 or 10 meals a day. But for me, being able to split that up over 4 meals or 2 meals, 2 shakes, as I do, is a heck of a lot easier. And I think it's far more conducive to muscle accretion and retention.
And it's interesting, isn't it? So that, a lot of the people that we see, which would be quite similar, might even be under that term, dare I say it, the worried well. Now, that term worried well, we spoke about last time with regards to supplements. And the standard line is, oh yeah, people who take supplements are the worried well, people who don't need to worry about taking supplements. Whereas people who have heard about fasting and who might be adopting it might almost fall into that camp of, they're the people who may be least likely to have to follow an aggressive fasting protocol in order to get the major health benefits.
Let's talk about habitual undereaters, and we... this is not really based on anything apart from, I guess, a gut. But, you and I and others were looking at doing some survey research on undereating. Yeah. And we had sort of spitballed but between us the idea that, from our clinical experience, maybe 20-odd% of people are habitual undereaters. Now, I see quite a lot of habitual undereaters, and they're often people who are following fairly extreme versions of keto or, are fasting very aggressively. And they don't realize that they're undereating. But when we actually look at it and quantify what they're doing, they're eating very minimal calories. And so for those people they're typically trying to get those benefits, right? They're really enamored with the ideas of particularly autophagy, mitophagy, boosting NAD, things like that. But not realizing that all of those things are kind of inconsequential if you're simply not providing the fuel and the nourishment that you require to thrive.
Yeah. Super interesting, isn't it? Because I put a post up on Facebook yesterday about fasting, how fasting is great until it actually isn't. And I think that's describing exactly what you were talking about, right? It's that people adopt it and it for a period of time, things do tend to work really well, but it's almost like any sort of dietary change. If it's now removing certain types of foods that might be upsetting your gut or might be creating blood sugar stabilization issues, when you sort that out, it's awesome. But the thing that often I see is, well, if I feel this awesome at this rate, I'm going to do it a little bit more, do a little bit harder, so I feel even more awesome.
Yeah, certainly can be. I mean, I see that in practice, and equally I see people who have legitimate health concerns who have taken up fasting or something else as a way to try and correct that. But particularly IBS, I see a lot of clients with IBS who have started fasting, or they've started doing keto, or various sort of, I don't want to say restrictive in a negative sense, but they are more restrictive forms of eating. And often they get good results, but then they start to get a bit of a rebound. I've seen this a lot with IBS, where people start avoiding foods and get some benefit, but perhaps over restrict or over fast, and then their IBS comes back with a vengeance. And I think the reason in that case is probably because of undernourishment, underfueling, the effect of that on, our latent stress state, so our catecholamine production, the effect of that on the gut, and then it basically becomes this cycle. And I've had a lot of success in the last couple of years helping people to improve their IBS, and recover from IBS, in a lot of cases by applying nutrition strategies that are far less restrictive. So fast for a shorter period of time, or add a meal back. Maybe don't be so strict on the keto because it's probably unnecessary for you. You can still stay low carb, but you can have a lot more flexibility within that. Have a broader compendium of foods while still avoiding some of the key trigger foods for that individual. And I want to reiterate the importance of protein as well, and how that's not often discussed with respect to fasting, because typically if we all agree that, and we should, that the biggest impact of fasting is to auto-regulate energy down, then that is of benefit to a lot of people, no doubt, because that's obviously the challenge, right, is that people are inadvertently consuming too much. And yes, I'm going to get criticism because people say you're just a calories in, calories out guy, and anyone who knows me knows that's not true, but we also can't get away from the first law of thermodynamics. Notwithstanding, while we can get a lot of benefits from any strategy that allows us to auto-regulate our energy down, we might be able to get more benefit, particularly if we're looking for the long term, muscle retention in particular, from having strategies that also allow us to get in sufficient protein. And if I were to stick to a 1 meal a day strategy, for example, as a lot of people do, I really don't think it would work, because I would find it near impossible to get in 160 grams of protein in one meal.
Yeah. That's a real challenge. That would obviously be a real challenge. And I know people are probably aware of this, that 160 grams of protein isn't 160 grams of steak. It is, we're talking about almost 4 times 160 grams of steak, like 600 grams. Like that's, people often think, I often talk to people and they're like, I get 100 grams of protein a day because they eat 100 grams of chicken, which, protein source food, protein, the nutrient different.
Exactly. And, I wonder whether, I'm pretty sure it's not optimal for protein synthesis either to have just one bolus of protein in a day. It probably is beneficial to split that up, and it doesn't need to be over a massive amount of meals, but let's say, 2 to 4 meals is going to be superior, I would say, to 1.
Yeah, and that's what I'm really interested to talk to Professor Lehman about, because as I understand it, there's sort of 3 to 4 may be the most appropriate amount. But again, he's like, well, we know breakfast, we know dinner. There's certain number of hours in between. It doesn't have to be every 3 hours that you're, stimulating that muscle protein synthesis process. But as I understand it, you shouldn't do any more than, say, 6 hours without sort of having a bit of a protein hit. But that might be wrong. And that's, that's what I'm interested to talk to him about.
It's interesting too, Mikki, because you mentioned breakfast and dinner. I've used fasting strategies myself and with clients in the past that are based around big protein feedings at just breakfast and dinner. So it's different to what most people consider fasting, because people think that it either needs to be early or late.
Yeah.
And so you're sort of compressing your feeding window, but I don't think there's anything like wrong arbitrarily with having a 2 meal a day strategy that bookends the day either. And for some people that works really well, because particularly if they're really busy through the day and they don't like eating while they're busy, it's just an opportunity to have a big meal, then work through the day and have another big meal to sort of bookend the day, collapse down your cortisol, relax, all those good things. So there are a lot of different strategies out there. And to a large degree, the proof of the pudding's in the eating, right? If what you're doing is giving you the results that you want, then it's a viable strategy.
Totally. And I do wonder about the evolutionary basis for that too, Cliff. Like there will be populations who Dr. Michael Rose has talked about this before, and he talks about an organic agricultural diet whereby there are populations in Eurasia, which is, as I understand it, a combination of Europe and Asia. But hey, I might be wrong about that, and actually probably am, because I know, like, I'm the worst at geography. That aside,
I think you're pretty fair to say that's correct.
Okay, good. Whereas our recent ancestors of like 20,000 years ago have been well equipped to deal with organic wheat, because that's part of their lifestyle back then. And so potentially for those individuals, not only would they be potentially more starch tolerant than other populations, but if they weren't living a nomadic lifestyle, then potentially they weren't required to be out all day sort of hunting and gathering and being away from a food source to then bring it back to the camp to consume. So I guess my point is that for some people, having that extended fast, or having the, like, eating sort of similarly sized meals throughout the day might be an evolutionary sort of they might be well equipped for that and might feel good on that. Whereas potentially if your recent ancestors were still more sort of nomadic, where they probably ate later on in the day, finished off what they had in the morning, and then went out hunting and gathering and not really eating all day, then maybe that particular person is going to respond better to the fasting approach that you just described.
Yeah, I mean, quite possibly. And, I think we also need to consider that there is no perfect diet for anyone, right? There are just strategies that work, and those can shift over time. And I know that Eric Helms and I have talked a lot about this in the past, the idea of sort of outcomes-focused eating. What I mean by that is that people will often try to find the best diet for them.
Yep.
Right? So let's say I'm a keto person. I'm going to say, well, keto is the best diet for me.
Yeah.
And it has to be this particular idea of keto that I have, under 50 grams of carbs, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But let's say that person then wanted to gain appreciable amounts of muscle, or they were starting to do a lot more higher intensity activity. It would seem silly for them to be constrained by what at that point has become a dogma, which is now in contrast to what their physiological requirements actually are. Now, I'm not saying that someone who thrives on keto should stop it necessarily, but there can be flexibility where, as you and I have discussed, as we've discussed with Dan Plews and others, one person's keto may not be the other person's, and one person's keto at one time may not be the keto that they follow at different stages for different outcomes. So, for example, you might be a keto athlete like Dan Plews, who actually eats a relatively large amount of carbohydrate while still being, often in functional ketosis because his overall energy requirement is so high. Now, if he were really dogmatic about it and was to say, well, no, I'm not going to eat over this arbitrary amount of carbohydrate, then he would be sacrificing his performance. So this is where I think we have flexibility as humans who are really, along with pigs, the perfect omnivores. We can use, as a species, a huge amount of different strategies. Even as individuals, we can use a huge amount of strategies. I do well on high-carb diets, but I equally do really well on low-carb. And it really comes down to what my goals are and how I'm feeling at the time, and what is, making me qualitatively feel the best as well.
Cliff, you mentioned, and I like that we're sort of not using you as a case study, but you've mentioned a couple of things during our conversation that relate to what your current practices are, which people always find super interesting, myself included. And whilst right now you're saying you're trying to build muscle, yet also minimize body fat gain or even lose body fat, which for a long time we thought were mutually exclusive sort of goals. Can you sort of talk to us about how the thinking may have changed around that, or how our understanding might have sort of evolved?
It's a really good question, because I'm not sure that the thinking has entirely changed. I think it's that it's just known to be far more nuanced. Again, though, if we're looking at the research, it's going to tell us certain things. And I think most people would agree, and I think it's fairly clear that if you want to get maximal fat loss, then that should be a focus.
Yeah.
And the focus should obviously be on, enough protein to preserve muscle, which is actually possibly even higher than what you would require when you're gaining.
Yeah.
Right? But obviously you need that calorie restriction and the other things that go towards losing body fat. Obviously, if the priority is to gain a lot of muscle, then that should be the focus. And obviously you're going to want to be very hypercaloric with sufficient protein and all those other things. So those things probably would be to some degree mutually exclusive. However, in certain people, like a novice athlete, someone who's just started weight training, you can see prodigious changes in both. You can see a lot of body fat loss and a lot of muscle gain. Even in people who are fairly advanced, though, and this is probably not well illustrated in the literature, I think there are times when you can see significant muscle gain and significant fat loss where you're shifting within your own cycles of nutrition. What I mean by that is that if you've been fairly free and flexible with what you're doing, and maybe, as I had, you'd been drifting a little bit more into the sort of convenience foods and things just through, recent life changes and whatnot, then by changing the qualitative nature of the diet, I think you can get, more substrate deposition within muscle. You can certainly get some actual myofibrillar muscle growth, and you will also lose some body fat because your substrate partitioning or your nutrient partitioning is going to be better. In other words, you're going to be more likely to store nutrients within that more functional tissue of muscle, less likely to be overly adipose in terms of storage. So I think those two things can happen, but also within microcycles. One thing that I've been doing lately is cycling down my calories to lose a bit more body fat, but then bringing that back over, say, a 4-week period back to maintenance, and then going a little bit hypercaloric for a few weeks. So I can sort of cycle between fat loss and muscle gain. Now, I'm not typically someone who does a lot of tracking or quantification because generally for my usual health and performance for the sports that I'm involved in, I don't need to. But whenever there is a specific goal that you want to achieve, obviously it helps to be a little bit more fine-tuned about it. And I guess the analogy, a really good analogy actually, is the one that Dan John uses. It's either you have bus stop or park bench, right? When you're on the park bench, you're basically just putting in time, doing your thing. Whereas with the bus stop, you're waiting for the bus. So there's a time-dependent outcome. And that's sort of, that's not usually most of your living training year. But certainly for certain periods, you want to really focus on a particular outcome. You've got to be more defined about what you're doing. And I don't think there's a problem with that either. Like, I think that, I know I'm going on here, but a lot of the feedback we now get is don't track, don't quantify, don't do these things because that is going to be triggering for people, or it's going to create an idea of shame or victimization. But it doesn't need to. The intention, if we're doing things for ourselves, can be quite contra to that. If I'm not triggered by doing some tracking every now and then, and I'm not approaching it in a way that I'm within which I'm feeling shame or I'm feeling guilt or that I don't like myself or the way I look, because I'm cool with the way I look. I'm cool with the way my body is. I love every part of my body, even if it's a little bit fat at times. That's cool. Like that's fine for me. Yeah. It's just an indication that when I see that, I think, you know what? For my long-term health, this is an indicator of something that's not quite right in my lifestyle. So I can just fine-tune that a little bit. And the big indicator for me recently was that I think I mentioned this last time, my waist measurement had got up over half of my height. Now, I'm going to have a slightly blockier midsection than the normal person as well, because I have done a lot of heavy lifting through my life. So I have bigger erector spinae, I've got bigger obliques, things like that. So I'm probably never going to be this svelte, thin, lean, waisted person. However, it was still an indicator. And when I looked at myself realistically, I realized that, I have become a little bit too adipose. And it's not necessarily going to be conducive to long-term health. Interestingly, as I started losing body fat, I noticed that my joint pain went way down.
Yeah.
Other things, brain fog and things like that, which weren't terrible because I'm a very healthy person overall, but they improved markedly. And it just goes to show that the milieu of inflammatory things that happen, that inflammatory cascade that results from our adipose-driven inflammation, is actually pretty pronounced.
Yeah.
And anyone who feels that and experiences it is going to have a very clear indication in their mind that, hey, there are certain things I can do, not for anyone else, but just for me to feel a heck of a lot better.
Yeah. So does that involve for you? You mentioned that you're not normally a tracker, but has that involved over the period of what you're doing? Are you tracking some calories in your hypocaloric? Are you sort of being more mindful of, how high you push the calories when you're in that sort of surplus? Is that how you're using tracking, Cliff?
Yeah, and like I say, I don't track frequently, but periodically I will. And usually for me, that involves probably only 2 periods of 3 days in any given year. But like recently, if I do have a defined goal, then I will track for longer. So I tracked for 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And that was really just to make sure that I was, hitting those hypocaloric targets. And then as I started to ease back into more, closer to maintenance and a little bit hyper, I don't track per se. I just do a little bit of planning. And then I know roughly how much I should be having at each meal. And I know that if I don't need to be really strict on anything, I've been in the game long enough to know pretty much what is in a meal.
Yeah.
But generally too, like if I'm gaining, this is a bit of a cheat here, like a cheat in terms of like a, gaming cheat.
Yeah.
I'll usually just have a good idea about what my maintenance calories are and how much protein I should be taking in, things like that. But then if I have a treat after dinner or something like that, I'm not worried about it because I figure I'm not going to go completely overboard, but that's probably going to be enough extra calories to fuel the muscle growth.
Yeah, nice. I think tracking for me, and I've spoken to my friend Julianne, our friend Julianne Taylor about this as well, is that it's, it's something relatively...
A very good nutritionist?
Yes, a very good nutritionist. It's been some relatively new thing for me over the last year. And what I find, it's the opposite is true. It actually really helps me ensure that I feel enough because, we spoke about people who are habitual undereaters. I absolutely fall into that camp. And so by tracking calories, what that allows me to do is go, right, okay, I need to make sure that I'm getting in this after dinner, or I'm having this additional snack, or I'm putting this additional thing on my lunch, because otherwise I can very easily habitually undereat for successive days. And where I find what happens, I know qualitatively that happens because my sleep starts to become disrupted and I start feeling a little bit more irritable and a bit grumpy, but I don't want to wait for the qualitative stuff. I want to make sure that I prevent it from happening in the first place. And that's where tracking has just been invaluable for me, I think.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, I often undereat as well. But if I'm not, fully aware of what I'm doing, maybe if I'm slipping a little bit, I might still be undereating, but it's just the distribution of what I'm eating is not quite on point either. And so that's where tracking really helps. Particularly, I know we've discussed this before, particularly it comes down a lot of the times to making sure you're taking in enough protein. And without realizing it, sometimes if I'm slipping a little bit, it's simply about not getting enough protein, maybe getting a little bit too much of the refined food in there. And so even though I'm not going to put on massive amounts of body fat, my body composition is still not going to be as good as it otherwise could be.
Yeah.
And again, it's not even about looking ripped or anything. It's just that there is a certain point at which any of us will recognize that our body fat has got a little bit too high for us. And that's then driving that inflammatory cascade, which is going to cause a bunch of other problems. And it's not till we have actually been leaner and we've had some consistency of a really good lifestyle that includes, the minimum effective doses for movement, whether it be resistance, endurance, cardio type stuff, a diet that's qualitatively based around unrefined foods, things like that. It's not till we've been in that consistent process for a little while that we really recognize how different we feel doing that versus how we were when we were just, getting by.
Yeah, totally. And I feel that you've sort of that term minimum effective dose is so important here with when we discuss nutrition and exercise related things. Things isn't the word I wanted. Damn it, Barry, just cut that a little bit. What was it?
I was going to say stuff.
Yeah, I know. Things and stuff. Like, God, we are our brains, man, on point. But when we discuss these, components of nutrition and exercise, minimum effective dose really is, I think, a really key concept that I want people to consider. And if we go back to our discussion around fasting, people are thinking that to fast, to go in and do a 24-hour fast once a week, or do, even two 24-hour fasts in a week, let's say Monday and Tuesday, for example, that's sort of required in order to optimize their metabolic health, well-being, and a great way to sort of cut calories, for example. But most people who adopt that approach, who are doing it from a body composition point of view, never see the outcomes that they want. Like, I haven't met anyone who has said, yeah, I did that and it worked awesome. Most people do it and don't really, they do it because they think it's what they should do, but don't really sort of evaluate what impact it necessarily is having. So with minimum effective dose with fasting, if you want to do it, that's awesome. And if you can find a way that works for you, that's awesome. But it doesn't have to be, if we're just thinking about optimizing health and well-being, it doesn't have to be 3 to 5 days a month, or 18-6 every day of the week, or one meal a day, or anything like that. Like, people often like to go to the extremes where it's just not necessary.
Yeah, and I think within that, people need to consider that it's very easy to become enamored with something and then perceive that it's the optimal way to do things. And I think what we really need to look at is that with most of these fasting strategies, they are in fact they're a hack, right? They're a hack that allows people to maybe have a bit more flexibility and freedom during their non-fasting periods, or they're a hack that allows people to auto-regulate their energy intake down if they're really having difficulties with that. And so they're obviously valuable, and I'm certainly not criticizing them because I've, been involved with fasting. I know a fair bit about it. A lot of my clients fast. But does that mean it's optimal? Not necessarily. It could be that if someone were able to change other tactics within what they're doing and their overall lifestyle strategy, they might actually get slightly better body composition results. And I would suspect that's true for people who do maybe day on, day off fasting, or people who do maybe 5-2 very aggressively, things like that, because I just don't think that, for example, muscle accretion and retention would be optimized with those types of aggressive strategies. It's not to say they're bad, and it's not to say people shouldn't do them, but if that were one of the outcomes they were looking for to really optimize muscle mass, for example, it's probably not going to be the right strategy. And anyone who tries to say that it is because of some dogma around the superiority of fasting, I think they're just barking up the wrong tree.
It's interesting. I have a couple of clients, and how they use fasting is really just from that, at the outset we talked about auto-regulating calories. And that's in fact what they use it for. So they know that in the weekend, they like to be a little bit more flexy with their food. They might have a couple of drinks. They like to have, sit down and enjoy a platter of delicious food on a Sunday. And they're like, well, you know what? It actually works really well for me to then go into Monday and skip breakfast, which might be 500 or 600 calories. It's not a lot, but over the course of a week, it's enough to, their calorie budget is such that they are able to have more calories in the weekend. And then they're not counting calories, but by virtue of what they're doing, they're reducing calories on that Monday. And I feel like that calorie cycling can actually be really beneficial for a lot of people, whether or not they necessarily count them themselves. And some people will, and they like planning it. But some people, just the knowledge that that's what they're doing and they're not doing it every single day of the week. They're just knowing that that's sort of allowing them that flexibility. And I feel that's where a time restricted eating window, or whatever you want to call it, can be super helpful for some people who are already sort of where they want to be.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I think, we all do that to some degree. And unfortunately, I think as well, there's been a bit of opposition to that, from maybe more orthodox nutrition authorities who have looked at cycling, or whether it be saving some calories or maybe even saving some carbs so that you can have them at another time. That's seen as being problematic eating. It's seen as being disordered eating. But disordered eating is really defined by the individual's responses.
Yeah.
It's defined by the fact that if they are, a binge isn't a binge unless there's guilt and shame associated with it.
Yeah.
If you're simply overeating and you've given yourself the freedom to do that, that's not necessarily a problem. In fact, it's probably a very natural thing to do.
Yeah.
I can't imagine that as hunter-gatherers, if we came across a beehive, that we wouldn't just go crazy on honey.
Yeah.
Right? We would. But it was consistent with and appropriate to our environment because we wouldn't have had the largesse of, particularly ultra-refined foods that have driven up our energy intake. And so I think it's a very natural thing. But also, when we get away from dogma a little bit, we can start to be a little bit more flexible within any type of strategy like that. So here's an example. People may want to fast quite aggressively because it maybe saves a bit of calories for them. Maybe it saves a little bit of carbs for them to have at other times when they can be a little bit more free. But if that fasting strategy reduces their protein intake to less than optimal levels, what's the problem with just adding some protein in? In terms of, let's say you're typically doing a 16-8 fast. What would be the problem in, say, doing what I do, which is to have a big protein shake straight after training in the morning? Is that going to ruin all of your results because maybe it's going to slightly impact autophagy, or maybe it's going to slightly impact that reduction in IGF-1? Well, not necessarily, because the overall impact of having that extra bolus of protein is probably going to far outweigh those things.
Yeah.
So I don't think we can become too, this plays into the question that I'm sure you get a lot. I get it all the time. What's the optimal length of fast?
Yeah.
Well, it's unanswerable because not just does no one know, but it's context dependent.
Yeah.
So it always depends on the individual. Like the optimal length of fast for someone who is a habitual undereater is probably to sort of not fast, but by virtue of just sleeping, they're probably going to have, let's say, a 12-hour fast anyway.
Yeah.
That's fine. That's great. Who cares? Like I probably fast for 12 to 14 hours a night because, I stop eating and by the time training's finished, I've got my shake and all that kind of stuff. It'll just be that naturally. The research is actually pretty good on the autophagy benefits of a 14-hour fast and the immunological benefits of a 14-hour fast. And I wouldn't need to go any longer anyway, but I'm not necessarily looking for those outcomes because there are also other impactors of those things.
Yeah.
People forget that a nutrient-dense diet that is based around unrefined foods is going to have some of the benefits in terms of like helping to preserve NAD levels, for example. Exercise is going to help with mitochondrial health. That's going to help to preserve those as well. Exercise is going to be a massive impactor of autophagy. And autophagy is not an on-off switch. It's like keto, right? It's not an on-off switch. It's not like suddenly, well, we've got autophagy occurring.
Yeah.
If it didn't occur, if you didn't have natural cycles or natural processes of autophagy, mitophagy, apoptosis happening basically all the time at some level along a spectrum, you'd be dead.
Yeah.
These things occur. It's just that they get ramped up at certain stages.
Totally. And I agree with you on that fasting and the protein, which is one of the reasons why with my Mondays Matter program, I use that protein sparing modified fast. So it's like a fast mimic, but it's a day where people just eat protein and, it's around about, it's between 100 and 130 grams of protein. There's, not much else sort of in there, but it's sort of almost the space I've sort of evolved to where I feel comfortable saying to the general, for most people, this is actually going to be appropriate. Of course, if I've got people who are more active on that plan, we bump up the calories, we put some carbs in there because actually their ability to fuel their workout and recover from that trumps any sort of other additional benefit that you might get from just being super low everything on that day. Like, and that's a hard message to sort of sell people who are so sold on the idea of fasting that they're like, oh, but this one banana is really going to throw out everything. And I'm like, no, that's going to be the making of you, actually, if you just sort of do it.
Exactly. It reminds me a lot of the discussions we used to have back in the 90s on how to optimize growth hormone. And so, people were, not eating a lot of protein, and they were not eating for long periods of time after training, all with the idea that it would result in some increase in growth hormone. But the problem is you become so undernourished that any increase in growth hormone is kind of inconsequential because you're then losing out on a whole bunch of other things.
Yes.
So, we don't want to go for the small gain at the expense of the larger gains. But it's interesting what you're talking about as well here, Mick, because for some reason I thought I'm going to look back at the old anabolic diet that was published probably back in, I'm guessing 96 or something, maybe earlier, by, Dr. Mauro De Pascali.
Oh, yeah.
And I realized that a lot of those things that I picked up from those guys back in the day and from Dan Duchesne, I kind of still do.
Mm.
And a lot of it is to do with banking, particularly carbohydrate.
Yeah.
Because for the simple reason that I know nowadays I'm not as active as I used to be when I was, competing and things like that. I know that there are certain things I'm still probably going to do.
Yeah.
Like I'm going to have a burger on a Friday night. I'm going to have some fries with it. I'm probably going to have some chocolate bars or cookies in the weekend. So it makes sense just to limit my carbohydrate during the week, which is basically the anabolic diet.
Yes. And
then allow myself a bit of a carb up in the weekend.
Yeah.
It's just about finding those strategies that allow you to have that optimized intake over time.
Yeah.
Because, why would I have half a cup of rice at lunch, which I don't really enjoy, if that means I can't have a Snickers bar on the weekend?
I totally hear you. And I feel the same about like hot chips and beer. Like I love a stout. So if it means that I'm not going to have half a cup of rice with lunch because it means that I can enjoy half a stout at dinner or a stout at dinner, then that's going to be my preferred option. And that's the flexibility that is afforded by an approach like that.
I remember in summer when I lived in Canada and I was working with the human motion team up there, we're all sort of strength coaches and I was doing the nutrition for all of our athletes and things. We all had this saying that we saved our carbs for beer.
Yeah.
So we would basically just eat meat and vegetables, and we'd know that we'd be having some beers. So that was where our carb intake was coming from.
Yeah, perfect Weight Watchers approach actually. Like I got a lot of my nutrition information and knowledge in my teenage years from going to Weight Watchers, and so they were very big on volume, like going for gold on vegetables and things like that, which is something which has remained part of my approach today. And because I'm a volume eater and I love it, but equally, like when I'm talking to people about enjoying alcohol, I do suggest them going light and lean if they're having alcohol with dinner, if they're wanting to sort of minimize the overall impact of it. Because of course, it's preferential oxidation. Alcohol will be oxidized before anything else. Fat is very easily stored. And so if you sort of keep it light and lean, you're minimizing that impact of that alcohol approach. Having said that though, when Baz and I go out for date night, which we will do again in level 2, and we enjoy Mikki fries and wine, I'm not thinking, oh no, this is all just going downhill. No. A moment on the lips, forever on the hips isn't exactly going through my mind. It's like sweet chips and wine or beer is delicious.
Oh, absolutely. And that's one thing that irrespective of where a client is at or where I'm at in any particular process, I never completely eliminate those treats.
Mm.
I might have a metric where I sort of think, well, for example, when I was, doing these fairly, rapid sort of fat loss cycles recently, I just do a little metric where I know how many meals I'm going to eat roughly in a week, right? Because I eat, 4 meals a day. So do the math, 4 sevens, 28 meals. I'd know that, roughly 5% of those could be treats, right? So that's not a lot. But if I'm in more of a sort of maintenance type phase, or, even gaining, then it's going to be somewhere between 10 and 20% of those meals could actually be, functionally treats. Now, I know that's probably a little bit nerdy and quantified, but it's just because that's the way my mind works. It helps me to have some structure. I'm not stressing myself out with quantification. I'm actually giving myself freedom because then I have a structure within which to be free. And I think that's where a lot of the debate is missed, because people say, well, you're so rigid. But it's not rigidity. No. It's actually freedom. But we always need some structure to actually feel completely free. As Jocko Willink would say, discipline equals freedom.
100% agree with that. And, this whole idea of that having diet rules means that you're rigid and you can't be flexible, I think is completely missing the point, because people get confident when they've got a set sort of structure. They gain confidence knowing this works for them, and then they understand what might happen, or they understand how they can then do exactly what you've described and have other things in their diet and not feel out of control, not feel like they're no longer sort of reaching their goals. I feel there's a lot of freedom to be had from food rules too, actually.
Oh, exactly. And so long as they're not, overly restrictive, and so long as they work for the individual, that's the key, right?
Yeah, because what is restrictive to me might be completely sort of flexible and not at all restrictive to you. So it's sort of working within that individual scope. Interesting if we go back a little bit to fasting and protein and whatnot, I sort of feel like some of the people who are who are experts in longevity, and they may have written books on it and things like that, I don't feel they're very protein focused, actually. And when I've heard the likes of David Sinclair sort of talk, he talks around this 10% of calories coming from protein as being, what we sort of need to shoot for. And I do feel that...
I mean, that's crazy.
I think it's crazy. And what I get a sense of, he's absolutely an expert in his field, but that suggests to me he's not an expert in protein metabolism and requirements.
Yeah, I think you can be an expert in a field without being an expert in the application of information to what's actually going to work for people.
Yeah.
And, I think that's where you're, an expert. A lot of the people we work with, I think, are experts not in necessarily the really nerdy lab side of things, but the translation of research into application, into clinical application, into functional outcomes. I think what we're often dealing with is what amounts to fairly, again, skinny effects over a long period of time for a particular hard endpoint being mortality.
Mm-hmm.
I think if we asked a bunch of people, number one, I don't think necessarily the research translates to the human experience very well anyway, because we're looking at animals who have quite a very different life cycle. This is one of the challenges I think we have with studying or applying particularly mouse models to humans, is that they live for an incredibly short period of time anyway. Now, when we translate that to a larger mammal that lives for a long, long time, we need to consider that there are a lot more nuances in how we live, and the physical structures that we need to create and maintain for a long period of time. So we know that one of the biggest impactors of morbidity and mortality is muscle mass. And if we're going to lose muscle mass because of a really low protein intake, then I think that that's going to be a big issue in terms of mortality and morbidity, which you're not necessarily going to see in a shorter-lived mammal. Now, what we're potentially looking at is fairly skinny effects at the end outcome being mortality, but that avoids the question of what's the quality of life through the lifespan. And most people would agree that having a higher protein intake and the benefits that provides is going to outstrip that, not to mention that bigger factors that also play into mortality and morbidity are going to be heavily affected by a human's protein intake. And if we're limiting protein intake drastically through the lifespan, it's going to be a lot harder for people to have optimal satiety and auto-regulation of energy intake. So potentially the negative outcome is going to be more. And obviously quality of life through lifespan is a pretty big part of it.
For sure. And, if you're good at fasting three days a month, every month, and you don't notice a change in your body composition for the worse, or that you find it more difficult to maintain muscle mass, awesome. But it can, for some people, just things might not change on the scales, but they might notice other changes in terms of their body composition, which we need to, I don't know, it's always just good to reflect on whether or not you're doing whether what you're doing is actually working, or are you just doing it and not seeing that benefit.
I mean, I just think that when we look at the research that's been conducted on humans, I think overwhelmingly we see positive benefits from protein. And, even if there is a very minor reduction in lifespan, I don't necessarily buy it, but if there is, we need to look at health span. That's been, I mean, we both know this.
Yeah.
But that's been something that has changed appreciably for the worse in the modern human. So we often talk about the fact that we live a much longer lifespan, and we don't. We live a marginally longer lifespan. We have a marginally longer lifespan now than we might have had in pre-agrarian society. Obviously, lifespan did drop appreciably with sort of agrarian systems, but it improved a lot, predominantly through reductions in child mortality. When we correct for that, the difference in lifespan wasn't that great. But yes, we live a little bit longer now, but not much longer. Mm-hmm. But we certainly live for a lot longer in pain and in distress and in poor health. And so, that I think needs to be part of the equation, because it's not palatable for people to talk about. Do we prolong someone's life arbitrarily, even if that quality of life is absolutely terrible? And is that a good spend on a personal level? Is it a good spend on a societal level? I don't know. I would suggest probably not. But what things are going to help promote, yes, longevity, but more so a great quality of life throughout the lifespan? I think those are far more important.
Yeah, nice, Cliff. And I unsurprisingly agree with you. We don't agree on everything, but I think 99% of what we talk about, we're probably in alignment. So maybe this is just a big old echo. Are we just creating an echo chamber?
Probably.
Do you reckon?
But I think people listening in who aren't in our echo chamber will either agree or disagree, and I think that's good. And there'll be plenty of people out there who don't agree with our position on certain things, or your position on certain things, my position on certain things, and that's great. Because we all would have shifted our position on certain things over time. I'm always willing and, looking forward to shifting my position where the evidence shifts, or where a compelling argument is made for something else. And I think if we can approach these discussions with that as a foundation, and do it in a way that is as far as possible free from logical fallacies, particularly the argumentum ad hominem, then I think we'll all be in a much better position. Because I'm certainly not enamored with the way that social media has become, especially with call-outs. I don't really see the point in calling someone out to pander to your fans so that they can all agree that, yes, someone else is wrong.
Yeah.
Because it's not constructive. And so typically when people call out others, or they have ad hominem or create ad hominem attacks, I just block them. Don't have time in my life for that kind of rubbish. I'd rather engage with people who we can have a constructive discussion, even if I vehemently disagree with them. Mm-hmm. And that popped up on one of my threads, because one of my friends said, I can't believe that you're friends with this person because they are, crazy. And I said, I don't want you to say that kind of shit on my thread, because you're now getting ad hominem. You might disagree with that person, and I disagree with that person. I think that 99% of what they say is wrong.
Yeah.
But I'm still going to entertain their point of view, because it will make me better as a person.
Yeah.
There might be a small inkling in there of something they say which is correct, and that might cause me to shift my position. Or even in, when we're challenged by people who do have alternate positions to us, we reevaluate our position to see whether it is in fact correct or whether there is some nuance to it. We see that a lot nowadays with the vaccine debate because, as I said last week when we chatted, I'm pro-vaccine, but that doesn't mean that I believe vaccines are completely innocuous, because vaccines do have adverse events. They do kill some people. It comes down to risk versus benefit. And so we evaluate that pragmatically. And I'm always very interested to be challenged by anti-vaxxers, because often they bring up points that are worth me investigating so that I can understand the topic more.
Yeah. That's such a valid point, Cliff. And if you're if you have that mindset of, it's a growth mindset really, isn't it? Like, it's not, a lot of people sort of come at things unintentionally with this fixed mindset approach. And a growth mindset doesn't mean you're always open to changing idea, or you're always going to be changing your opinion or flip-flopping between things or anything like that. But it's just having the mindset that you can always sort of learn from other people and learn from others' experiences and use that information to then evolve your own thinking. I think that's in every part of your life, that's sort of ideally where you'd be, right?
Yeah. Well, I can't remember what the term for this is, but there is a fallacy in which at any point in time we believe that we either know all there is to know or that we're pretty damn close. When in fact, in terms of the totality of what can be known, we know next to nothing.
Yeah.
And even if we look within our lifetimes, Mikki, when you studied nutrition first time around, when I studied nutrition first time around, they hadn't discovered leptin.
Yeah, isn't that crazy?
Isn't that just an example of how things can shift massively? And we can discover, they hadn't discovered the glymphatic system of the brain.
Yeah, or that we had 5 quad muscles and not 4.
I didn't know that. So I was this many years old when I learned that.
In fact, what you're referring to is the Dunning-Kruger effect. That's
the Dunning-Kruger effect is a little bit different. That's when we
think we know it all.
Isn't that when we overestimate? Yeah. Oh, yeah. So no, it's similar to that. It's more of a temporal thing rather than a personal type of thing.
Yes.
What I mean is that through history, at times we'll sort of think, well, for example, this is the science. The science says this, therefore it's absolutely correct. Whereas I would say that that's a flawed position, because what we can say is the evidence tells us this, so it's likely to be that this is the case. But there's still going to be nuance. There's still going to be shifts and changes, and there are going to be things we discover, like leptin, like the glymphatic system. We'll discover that the brain is way more neuroplastic than we thought it was. All those things. We'll understand that neurogenesis occurs. We'll understand topics like autophagy a lot more than we previously did, although most people still misunderstand it, and I'm sure I misunderstand it on some level as well.
I think you misunderstand how to pronounce it, to be honest. Autophagy.
Well, you're an autophagy person.
I'm an autophagy person. That's fine. So Barry thinks that you say, so if you go to a water park, you're going to an aquatic park, is what I would say, like aquatic. He's like, it's aquatic. I'm like, no. It's not aquatic. It is aquatic.
Does he say quad for quad muscles?
I'm going to ask him. That. In fact, he'll be editing this, and he can just reflect on the way that he pronounces. But I won't say anything else because I'm very grateful that he is making Mikkipedia happen.
The debates are endless, aren't they, between fungi or fungi or GIF or GIF?
Oh, there's no debating that. It's totally a Giphy. See, it's a Giphy. It's not even a GIF or a GIF. It's a Giphy. Anyway, I think now we just headed into the weeds. Cliff, always great to talk to you. I love getting your perspective. I love that this is yet another opportunity to jump on and just talk nutrition with you, and in a way, like, this is such a geeky conversation, but we both love it, and that's what I love about talking to you, and I think that's what a lot of people love listening to too. So thank you for your time.
I love getting on the podcast, Mikki, because it means you do all the heavy lifting and I don't need to do one of my own this week.
That's fantastic. And in fact, you say I do all the heavy lifting. That credit goes to Barry. He's the editor. When I said he makes Mikkipedia happen, I'm not joking. He is actually the person. All I do is get behind the microphone and do what I do best, just talk. He does all the heavy lifting with that. But I've got to have interesting people to talk to, and you're always one of those people, Cliff. So thank you.
Do you think I could headhunt Barry?
Steal
him away as my producer.
You could. He's doing quite a nice little sideline business over here. So, yeah.
Awesome,
all right, Cliff. So we know where we can catch you. You're at Human Performance Nutrition, Holistic Performance Nutrition.
Yep, at the Holistic Performance Institute, holisticperformance.institute.
That's hilarious. I've called you Chris and then I've mucked up your biz name, and all in the same podcast. People will be confused as to who I'm actually talking to.
You haven't quite, because Holistic Performance Nutrition is our nutrition side of things. So
brilliant.
You got it right.
Well, it's the place that I always send people to when they're like, I really want to upskill in nutrition, but don't think I want to go down the university route. And I'm like, head to Holistic Performance Institute and they will sort you out.
We appreciate that, Mikki.
Boom. All right, Cliff, you have a great day.
Thanks, Doc.
All right, team, hope you really enjoyed that as much as I do. Clearly, I enjoy having Cliff on the show and having conversations with him, and I'm sure that won't be the last time that we get to chat to Cliff. Next week, I have the pleasure of talking to Mikki, who is an amazing ultra runner, and we talk all about her experiences of training, overtraining, relative energy deficiency in sport, and bringing herself back from that. And there's a lot of synergies with Mimi and I, given our love of running, our love of nutrition and food, and we chat all about that. Until next week, team, you can find me over on Facebook at Mikki Williden Nutrition, on Instagram and Twitter at Mikki Williden, or on my website mikkiwilliden.com, where you can book a one-on-one consultation to chat with me, or sign up to any of my evergreen programs that focus on fat loss, eating a lower carbohydrate, highly nutritious diet, or if you want a keto longevity reset, we've got that too. Or join the waitlist for Mondays Matter, which is my signature group program, which is an 8-week protein-sparing modified fast approach for fat loss. And you do it as a group, and that kicks off mid-January. But for more information, join the waitlist so you know how it's all going to roll out. All right, team, until next week, have a great week. See you later.